When I decided on my major for my degree at UWS, I had already taken a few classes. I realized pretty quick that my interests really focused a lot on film, art, and design, as well as in the field of multimedia journalism. At the time, I hadn't really considered how those interests would end up shaping my experience in Superior. Looking back now, it all makes sense, but hindsight is 20/20. The focus of this project is something that evolved and shifted in multiple ways throughout the course of the last 2 years, but ultimately the theme has been consistent. What role does media play in the ways that we as individuals perceive ourselves, and how is it possible for self-expression to come from an appreciation and willingness to accept different points of view? Really, what it comes down to is I see this project as a chance to explore some of my oldest influences and the way that they helped to evolve my own self-perception over the years. What was it that turned this sweet kid into this frustrated teenager? And what shaped that kid into the person that I am today while making this documentary? When you hear the word media, what comes to mind? When I think of media, I'm not only talking about those things, the news, social media, but also about books, film, music, and every other form of expression that one can think of. Ceramics, graphic design, photography. What about the ways that we access those forms of media? Are the photos that we take in our camera the only ways in which we express our personal beliefs? What about the camera that we take the images with? Does it say something about me that I chose to buy a Canon? What about when I decide to share those photos to friends and family? Does the social media platform that I choose to share impact the way that people receive my work? Ultimately, there isn't just one answer to any of those questions. My dad and his 4 brothers were always into skateboarding. When they were teenagers, they had a half-pipe in their backyard that all the neighborhood kids would come and get injured at. I think this is mainly where I got a lot of my interest in skating, music, and artistic intrigue from. While working on this project, I was able to sit down with my Uncle Mike to hear some of his thoughts on skating, music, art, and the current media landscape in regard to social media and accessibility to subculture.
One thing with skateboarding that I've always liked is it's a pretty simple thing to learn, at least the basics, and you don't need a lot of extra equipment. You know, you can buy a pretty decent skateboard for not a lot of money, and you can ride it until it finally falls apart, and it's a pretty inexpensive pastime. And I guess that's what I've always liked about it is, you know, if you don't have a lot of money and you need something to do, you know, get the skateboard out and get together with your friends and go riding. It don't cost you any money and have a pretty good time.
My Uncle Mike does a good job of explaining what makes skateboarding so appealing to individuals with little to no resources wanting to express themselves. It's these same people that make up the subculture of skateboarding. In order to better understand subculture, I've asked my professor to talk a bit about subcultures and the ways that they began to develop in post-war era America.
When we're talking about subculture, I would say to some extent they've always existed in that anytime there's enough accumulation for there to be some kind of a dominant culture in a society, some kind of subculture tends to spring up. But if we're sort of talking about the modern definition of subculture, most scholars usually put it after World War II for a few different reasons. In the 20th century, we get the ability for mainstream culture to really connect people in a way that it hadn't before with the development of technologies like film, television, radio, that can all bring us together in much more synchronicity than anything prior to that point. So there's the possibility for a very different relationship to mainstream culture to emerge, which of course leaves more opportunities for subcultures to spring up in response to that mainstream culture. And it's really most thoroughly after World War II that we get the development of the American teenager, and along with it, this different period to life where you can really engage in leisure cultures, in different cultures of style, and form these subgroups that make up the spine of a lot of the different subcultures that emerge in both the US and in Britain.
One huge aspect of my own personal media exposure in my teenage years was growth of the popularity and incredible technological advancement of cell phones. Beyond the advancements of cell phones, the invention of social media has completely changed the landscape of communication as well as the cultural aspects of subcultural community. Because of these monumental changes in the ways that people communicate with each other, the idea of subculture begins to shift and it becomes more fluid. Ultimately, the connections people make are so much more accessible to the masses. It really becomes no surprise that when a subculture like skateboarding or punk music or hip-hop becomes popular, there are those connected to the dominant and controlling culture that find ways to profit off of it. So what happens when the dominant culture begins to absorb a subculture? When I asked my friend Grace, who grew up in the same era as I did, what she thought, I received some incredibly insightful points of view.
What happens when dominant cultures absorb subcultures is that that dominant culture grows. It could, in some ways, absorb more kinds of people, more of a diverse group of people who follow that culture, or it could essentially eat up those small cultures or those subcultures and kind of normalize them or expose them in a way they don't need to be exposed.
I think a part of what allows the dominant culture to so successfully absorb a subculture like skateboarding is the accessibility of media now. But why is this accessibility to media important, and how does that relate to the ways we perceive ourselves?
I would say I feel like it's a relationship that has only really intensified in the last 30 or so years, especially with the development of the internet, and that, the way we learn about the world is mediated in so many different ways. And if you go back to all of your old readers, that's where you learn literally what words are in the world around you. So you learn that through media in a core way. And as you get older, you learn more complicated stories and narratives about how you should live your life, whether those are older versions of myths or religious tales, more recent variations on moralistic traditions and ideas, or just learn by modeling different behavior from the TV we watch when we're kids or the video games that we play and consume. And I don't want to make the mistake of saying that we mimic every single thing that we learn, but the way so many of us have access to different spaces and places now is almost always through the media, especially in a time where we have a limitation on travel and our ability to see other things.
The ability to look up literally anything you want to with just a couple of pokes of your finger on your phone has to have some sort of impact on the way that you view the world.
In a lot of ways that, we're influenced by our immediate people, we're also greatly influenced by media because we get to look into those cultures. We look into those cultures and we admire bits and pieces of that culture, and then we want to replicate it. Naturally, as human beings, we want to replicate beauty. We want to replicate sacredness. We want to replicate the things that we find peace in.
Prior to the current state of the internet, I had essentially no access and no real reason to look into different cultures or art or anything like that, but I was also pretty young. When I was around 8 years old, my dad brought me to the Walker Art Center for the premiere of skateboarding legend Stacy Peralta's documentary, Dogtown and Z-Boys. Watching the ways that the Zephyr team portrayed themselves and hearing all of the unique ways that they interacted with their surroundings totally inspired me as a kid. Skateboarding as a subculture seems to have taken a lot of its initial characteristics and aesthetic from Zephyr shop owner Jeff Ho and artistic visionary Craig Stesick. Ho and Stesick moved away from the free-minded hippie portrayals of skating in the 60s and offered a new and much more aggressive visual identity to the sport. Ho's innovative board designs were covered with Stesick's street art that captured the look of their heavily Latino-inspired surroundings. Their collective style has been described as when the debris meets the sea, and is the basis for the Zephyr team's image moving forward into the sport of skateboarding. While the Zephyr team is where I was able to find much of my own inspiration as a kid, they're not the only source of inspiration when it comes to skateboarding media and subculture surrounding skate media. I asked my buddy Adam, who's been skating from a young age, to tell me a bit about what had inspired him to start skating and embrace skating as a culture.
One of the first videos I ever saw, it was a King of the Road. It was Anti-Hero from like 07 or 2013. It was something. Andy Roy was on it, and I remember they were scaling this giant building, and there was this half pipe up on this giant building. It might have been Chris Fanner or somebody. And I remember somebody hucking the board up to him and just thinking, these guys don't give a shit. They're just like, they're trespassing on this giant monument and just having the time of their lives. They just didn't give a fuck. And coming from like my competitive sports area, I was kind of sick of listening to a coach, and then you just didn't really have to listen to anybody except for yourself, I guess.
Part of what appealed to me as well is the freedom of expression that being a skateboarder has to offer. Skaters like Jay Adams and Roddy Mullen really developed their own signature style early on in the sport. But much like the Zephyr team in the 70s, skateboarding had turned corporate. Somewhere along the line, businessmen realized that they could capitalize on this form of expression.
I did kind of notice, probably by the 90s, more and more, it seemed like companies were trying to really incorporate skateboarding into their image. Soda companies and clothing companies, and then some of the skateboarders actually, as they started to get some recognition, got involved in their own businesses promoting their own skateboards or clothing. And I do think it's made it more mainstream, or that was the beginning of it. And then some of these skateboarders, the ones who were really good and got known, became such celebrities that they almost became household names, like a Tony Hawk. I guess he's the first one I think of right away.
Tony Hawk stands out as being one of the most recognizable skateboarders on the planet. 3 months before the release of the Tony Hawk Pro Skater game, Hawk lands the infamous 900 in competition at the X Games. Because of this, his popularity soared through the roof, allowing him new forms of exposure and the ability to share skateboarding with the masses.
Yeah, the video game. I mean, again, if you look at early examples, who didn't have a neighbor or a best friend or somebody that had that fucking video game, and you went to their house and you saw these crazy stunts, and you listened to that Superman song and all that shit. I remember that song. Elliot remembers that song. That's shit that you don't forget. You remember like playing as the weird ass zombie characters and all that shit. But you also remember the kickflips and the crazy grind combos and how unrealistic it is. But that brought so many people to skateboarding. I mean, Tony Hawk is a skateboarder as much as he is a businessman, but he's still a skateboarder. He's old as hell and he's doing 900s and 720s and shit. You never can break away from it. If any of us have the opportunity to get a video game, who the hell would say, no, I don't want a video game with my name on it where it's doing the thing I love, Even Totino's pizza roll commercial. Tony's got a shit ton of those, but he's making money and he's still skateboarding, so I don't think you can bash it.
While Tony Hawk's video game may not be the only source of introduction to a lot of the younger generation of skateboarders, it definitely was one of the most important. What other ways were corporations beginning to make money off of subculture in the 90s and early 2000s? Ultimately, it was MTV that was able to capitalize off of the invention of cable TV. With this new piece of technology that allowed for media to be digested by viewers around the world, it was the perfect stage for Western cultures to begin the commercialization and exploitation of subcultures, which had developed over the years leading up to its inception. By creating a space in which youth could feel interactive by means of viewing music videos, as well as the inclusion of the new genre of television, reality TV. The concept of reality TV was essentially a way in which media producers were able to personify ideas about media representation. Jackass being a prime example, showing skaters like Bam Margera alongside comical masterminds like Steve-O and Johnny Knoxville. Jackass not only made television a more relatable concept to viewers, but also created the idea that anyone can be famous.
I remember growing up and seeing, episodes of Jackass where they're dropping in on crazy shit. There'd be little skate segments. And I think that draws people in, and it's not giving skateboarding a bad name, but someone like Bam, he does get a lot of hate because he broke away from skateboarding. He was once a skateboarder, but he's always gonna be a skateboarder. That's what he was known for, but now he's known for bigger things. Now he's known for drug abuse and stuff or whatever. But he's also a movie star, and he's always going to be a skateboarder. So I don't think there's any bashing that. People will bash that, and it's understandable to say he's a sellout, but he's always a skateboarder.
With the idea that fame is so easily accessible, the rise in social media became more prevalent and seems to be where most of the current development of media content is coming from.
It is so much easier to connect with people that share the same interests and concerns that you do. I talked about how media can be this place where you really find yourself, and that is something that can be wonderful to experience if you're using media as that conduit, but it can also be really alienating if you are the one person in a high school of 500 or 1,000 people that really likes something in particular. And social media has made it really possible for a lot of those people to find each other. And I think that's one of the great joys of social media, being able to find people who care in the same way that you do about other things and being able to link to them and stay in touch.
So while it's an amazing time we're living in, being able to connect with people so easily, I tend to find myself questioning my own ability to express myself properly. Realistically, in the last 15 years, my primary source of media consumption has been through social media. And while I do believe there are positive aspects to that, I'd be foolish to not acknowledge the negative as well.
Where social media is the most popular way of getting information around nowadays. And it is oftentimes more popular than the local news or the national news. But it has a lot to do with perspective, I think, too. It's like where are those people getting their information from compared to, where you're getting your information from.
Either way, the reality is that everything I've posted over the years has in some way profited a corporate entity. That's what's so interesting to me about social media. None of these platforms actually create content. All of the content on these sites are made by their users. This means that everything you post on social media can be considered content that gains profits for companies like Meta to grow profits from. You don't actually own the rights to anything you've posted on social media. You sign that away when you agree to the terms of service. This idea that everything that I've shared with the world in an attempt to get some kind of feedback or reassurance about my efforts has been used as a financial commodity by corporations that will never be completely transparent with their intentions of use with my content is troublesome, to say the least.
It's pretty amazing because at times I really hate the internet because I know sometimes with just all the misinformation and the instant news, it makes me feel stressed out sometimes, and it feels like it's hard to keep up to it. But on the other hand, I love the internet because I don't think I'd be able to do what I do for a living without it. I do most of my own promotion. I can when I do new work, I can put it out there and let people see it. You don't have to have a show set up by a gallery. It's really made it so that if you're willing to put the effort into it, you can really do a lot with your own career and your own ideas. And the internet and social media just makes it so much easier. It's just so much more accessible. And I do think if you're willing to work really hard at what you're doing, it makes it a lot more easy to be successful and a lot easier for people to see what you're doing and see what other people are doing too. Because I think that's really important, just to be able to see what else other people are doing, whether it be for creative inspiration or from a competitive standpoint, to see, what people who are doing similar work to yours, what they do, so either you can make yours look different or figure out what you like about that work. But it's pretty cool. It's a love-hate relationship, but boy, it's really influenced the work that I do.
Being able to see what other people are doing in real time is such a great ability, and I find myself trying to come up with new and unique ways to brand myself in a way that I can begin reaping the benefits of my efforts alongside the corporate entities that I've signed my rights away to. When I started the process of this project, I wanted to answer the question, if a subculture is absorbed by a dominant culture, then can it still be considered a subculture? I guess I never really got an answer to that, but that's not really the point.